Season 4 was by far the best season of DanMachi yet. Not only did it cover the undisputed best girl's backstory, but its return to the dungeon brought us back to what made it so good in the first place. It was the perfect combination of action and plot. The deep floors provided this constant sense of threat and danger, while the intertwined elements of Ryuu's story made all her actions have so much weight to them. So, for things to culminate with this epic battle against the very embodiment of Ryuu's trauma, well, that was the ideal ending to an arc centered around her. A grueling fight for survival that, despite being near identical to the novels, can still be made more impactful when accompanied by certain details left out from them. Let's get started. Episode 11, Luvia, covering the last chapters of Volume 14 of the light novel. With Belle and Ryuu now fully rested, the two began their way down what seemed to be a never-ending passageway. A secret, unexplored area of the dungeon, free of monsters yet far from any sort of known route or exit. The fantastical landscape made it seem like it was one of the dungeon's mercies, but as the passage continued for hours with no sight and end, Belle started to wonder if they would even escape from it. I mean, it's not like their rest had helped them fully recover from all the blood they'd lost. They were both still ill-suited for whatever adventure awaited ahead of them. Once the two did finally reach an exit, though, they found that all that was left was the maze's beast zone. The final maze between the 4th and 5th walls, after which there was only a direct passage leading straight to the floor above them. A key thing to note about this area is that, while it is known to be the most sparse when it came to encounters with monsters, the fact Belle and Ryuu hadn't seen any made it seem a little bit too sparse. Like, they could definitely sense several monsters around them, but because none of them had come to attack them, the two could only chalk it up to luck. So, as the two dismissed their good fortune as simple luck, what they should have been doing instead was wondering why. Why was it that no monsters were attacking them? Why was it that the monsters they were sensing hiding as if they were afraid of something? Well, right as Belle and Ryuu crossed that threshold into the beast zone, both immediately sensed the final boss that they would be challenged by. A familiar terror that had transformed itself into something even more fearsome. This wasn't just your typical enhanced species, but instead something entirely different. A grotesque anomaly stemming solely from the ingestion of monsters while they were alive. You see, by eating the monsters whole and absorbing their bodies into its own, the Juggernaut had turned itself into an irregular that even the dungeon had never seen before. It had taken every monster Belle fought on this floor and combined it together to create this chimera that was hell-bent on killing him. Sheep and Spartois constituted new bones, barbarian flesh created more muscle mass, lizardman scales now covered the tail, and obsidian rock reinforced the beast's severely damaged magic shell. It was a boosted magic defense stemming from the highly sturdy obsidian soldiers we talked about last episode. Now, something the anime doesn't really explain is that the white mist coming from the Juggernaut's mouth was actually a direct product of its unnaturally forced fusion. Its entire body was rejecting the new ligaments just like how the human body would sometimes reject a transplant, resulting in numerous bones and skulls to melt off its body like they had no other place to go. Not only that, but the Juggernaut's very body creaked in a way that made it sound like it was screaming. It was almost like every monster it ate was still alive and now crying out in immeasurable pain. Pain that was likely shared by the Juggernaut itself. But even so, the weapons it gained in exchange for this immense suffering was more than worth it if it meant that they could be used to slay the White Rabbit. It was a small cost that came with a hit to its mobility as well. Since Belle had destroyed its knee and weakened its lower body, the Juggernaut was far slower than it was before, much to the point that Belle could follow it and even parry its attacks now. So, what the Juggernaut did to make up for this was incorporate several projectiles into its arsenal. The Pila javelins which Belle had become oh so acquainted with. It was using them in a hit-and-run strategy specially curated to eliminate the two targets in front of it, one that took full advantage of the terrain it had placed itself in. Now, as soon as it caught them by surprise with the use of the floor boss attack, the Juggernaut went on to have a monologue, one that portrayed its inner thoughts much like how the Moss Huge had back in part 1. It's not something the anime shows very often, but certain monsters do have sentient thoughts that highlight what they're thinking. Which, for this case in particular, the Juggernaut was thinking about how resilient his targets were. No matter how much it tried to slay them, they would always find a way to survive and come back, making them the ultimate prey and targets that needed to be hunted no matter what. So, as the Juggernaut's assault finally connected with Belle, Belle's response was to fire as many firebolts as he could. They were indiscriminate shots that sent him flying backwards immediately after he'd cauterized his wound. Ryuu wasn't sure if this was his plan, but by not withstanding the recoil of his magic, Bell had effectively created a large gap between himself and the Juggernaut. He had created more space so that he could fire even more firebolts. He didn't know where or what he was aiming at, but the hope was that that would be enough to keep the enemy away from him. Even if none of the firebolts even made contact, at the very least the dust from the explosions would block the Juggernaut's vision on them, giving the two of them the time they needed to make it to the narrow passageway. Now, after the Juggernaut had given up on them, in addition to Bell being incapacitated from impalement, Ryu's right leg and hand were pierced and the nape of her neck was completely gouged too. They were both covered in blood as if they'd bathed in it. Bell did still have a bit of consciousness, but it took all he had to ask whether they were safe or not. It was a question in which both already knew the answer to, yet both still lied in hopes of providing the other comfort. Despite knowing all too well the dire fates awaiting them, neither wanted the other to think that they'd given up yet, especially Bell since he didn't want Ryuu to think that the future he promised was lost. It was a kind lie that desperately attempted to live up to the idea that they could walk together through the doors of the benevolent mistress again. So, as the two held each other in what they assumed were their last moments, Ryuu would allow herself to be tricked by Bell's lie. She would remain still on the boundary of life and death and spend her last moments drowning in one final happy dream. Of course, nothing could drown out the utter cruelty of one more companion being taken away from her, but that feeling of remorse was quickly dwarfed by a vision of snow. The warmth of Bell's body made it feel as if the two were being buried by it. She could see herself disappearing into a snowy field in which the only thing present was them. She definitely felt regret for not being able to do anything when it mattered most, but despite all that, she still felt happiness. Her last tender moments were this brief respite in which the two were tied more closely together than anyone else in the entire world, making her glad that she had conveyed her feelings, yet so terribly sad that this is what it had come to. She was so happy yet so incredibly lonely. Now, if Ryuu could dream those sweet dreams until everything was over, then that was all Bell could ever hope for. You see, to him she had suffered far too much already. So to make her live through all her trauma once again, well, that was something a hero like him couldn't allow. Even if his body was screaming all over in pain, that just meant that he had enough energy to move. And even if his heart raced with an insistence that he should run from death, that just meant that he had enough strength left to escape. But even with both that strength and energy remaining, there was no way that Bell would ever use them to escape death. No. Instead, Bell decided he would use them to defeat death. Despite his instincts, body, and heart all telling him not to, Bell's very soul defied them and stood up against it. He would ignore his entire self and every element that made him human and push beyond them in pursuit of the promise he'd made. The only aspect that remained of his human rationality was a single thought that reminded him of a story he'd once read. The sorrowful tale of Bellius the Guard, a heroic legend depicting an unyielding knight who fought for the elf of the lake. The elf loved the knight very much, but in the end the knight would die in her arms. He had become this martyr for love, much like how Bell was about to. Of course, Bell had no plans on dying, but if any hero was to give him strength, then Bellius the Guard was the one that he related to the most right now. Now, the reason the Juggernaut knew his targets weren't dead is because the dungeon had gifted it refined senses capable of tracking adventurers on the same floor as it. Since its sole purpose was to exterminate foreign viruses within the dungeon, it only makes sense that one of its abilities would be to track them. It's actually the reason why the Juggernaut was able to wipe the 27th floor so quickly. As for how it was going to handle its targets now, well, instead of trying to fight at a disadvantage in a narrow passageway, the Juggernaut decided it would instead hide in a room adjacent to them. It would make its prey think it had left, then jump out and strike the moment they were out in the open again. So, as it waited to enact the trap that it had set up for them, the Juggernaut was surprised to see its main target approach him instead. This white rabbit on the cusp of death had come out charging without any regard for his own safety or well-being. The Juggernaut could tell that death would get him soon enough, but having the Grim Reaper take his prey just wouldn't suffice for him. No, the Juggernaut wouldn't be satisfied unless it was him who killed the human. It had to be his claws that took Bell's life. It was, after all, the only reason the Juggernaut existed now. So, with every ounce of its being, the Juggernaut would put forward all he had to defeat this human. It didn't understand why the human fought so hard against him, but what it did understand was this human's intent to kill him. Just as the Juggernaut was hell-bent on killing Bell, so too was Bell determined to defeat the Juggernaut. It was a clash of unyielding determination and resolve. A fight to the death that the Juggernaut couldn't help but quiver at. Not because it was afraid of the tenacity its target was showing, but instead because it was happy to be faced by such. This monster who had spread so much torment and so much terror was now feeling joy for having come across such a persistent enemy. It was deeply moved and truly happy with the opponent it was about to fight with. Switching over to Ryuu now, the place she awoke was the boundary between life and death, a destination she'd longed to finally reach but could never fully cross up until now. She didn't remember how she'd got here or what she was doing, but the cold feeling in her hands made her feel sad for some reason, at least up until she saw her friends in the distance. As soon as she realized that she could finally join them, the pity she felt for being so alone and empty quickly turned to joy as she knew that that was no longer the case anymore. But just as we saw in the anime, Elise wouldn't let that happen. You see, as much as Ryuu just wanted to be set free from her turmoil, the truth Elise spoke wouldn't allow her to. She wasn't giving excuses or admonishing Ryuu for giving up, but instead just presented Ryuu with the way things were. She was reaffirming the fact that justice still remained in her. Just as how Belle had confirmed for her earlier, the justice she'd thought she'd lost never truly went away. No, the very fact she decided to live was proof of that. When Seer had come and saved her after her job was done, Ryuu's choice to be saved and continue onward was actually her making sure the justice of her friends lived on. She had always been seeking justice in the form of hope. She couldn't really see it herself, but it was ever since her familia died that Ryuu had been doing so. She wanted to believe that the values her familia instilled in her would eventually connect to hope and lead to peace within Arario. It was the very thing she'd been fighting for this entire time. So, just as Belle had said to her earlier, her actions had surely brought hope to someone. And if no one else, then at the very least it brought hope to Belle. This was the core of what Belle had been trying to tell her. There didn't exist such a thing as universal justice, but instead just the type of justice that best embodied one's own personal beliefs. And the justice that sought hope just so happened to be Ryuu's. It was a hope that went to illuminate the future, not the past. So, with Ryuu's justice now renewed, Ryuu committed herself to facing the symbol of her past that she'd feared for so long. The monster of calamity that personified every aspect of her trauma. The only way she would ever be able to face the future head-on was by first defeating the part of her that was holding her back. Only then could she start to live without regrets. Switching back to the fight, Belle had actually found a way to counter the Juggernaut. Since all it was doing was firing projectiles then moving, he had determined its pattern of movements then acted accordingly. Mainly by using Hakugen to deflect projectiles and to close the gap, then switching to the Hestia knife to do damage once in range for it. It was this alternating style of combat that perfectly shut down the Juggernaut's hit and run strategy. Now, the moment Ryuu stepped in to intervene, the Juggernaut became wild with rage as its glorious battle was being tainted by her. It was upset that another would step in and spoil its fight to the death with the sole target it yearned for. Since it knew it couldn't sustain its unnatural existence for long, the Juggernaut decided every second it had left would be spent fighting this boy. This white-haired rabbit that caused him so much trouble before. But now that this insignificant extra was interfering with its very reason for existing, well, that just made it want to squash her quickly. At least until she showed that she was a worthy opponent too. As soon as it saw that Ryuu was just as strong as Belle, it decided it was only right to kill both of them together. Initially, the fight was just a back and forth where both parties scouted for a lethal blow, but after about 5 minutes, the whole thing descended into what was essentially a struggle for dear life. A decisive attack like that wasn't even possible anymore. Instead, it was just whoever could hold out the longest without leaving themselves open. Considering the Juggernaut had half a magic shell and a body imbued with the natural properties of the absorbed obsidian soldiers though, that made it twice as resistant to magic. You see, not only did it still have its innate ability to reflect magic, but its new stony armor also gave it incredible resistance as well. So even if Ryuu did get her luminous wind off successfully, it wouldn't do much so long as those two defenses were still in place. That being the case, Belle knew he needed to act quickly. So he instinctively activated Argo Vesta knowing full well it would get the Juggernaut's attention. Even if it did know that Belle was just being a decoy, the trauma it carried from having lost its arm to this attack before made it so it couldn't ignore Belle no matter how hard it tried. It was well aware an elf was prepping magic right behind him, but the potentially lethal blow that could come from Argo Vesta made it so its focus had to be split between the two of them, resulting in the panicked AoE attack we see here. As we saw shortly after though, despite this attack successfully hitting both of them, it still wasn't enough to stop Belle from using Firebolt to shatter its defenses, finally opening up the Juggernaut to be finished off by Ryuu. Now, knowing just how resilient the Juggernaut was, Ryuu didn't make the same mistake that she did the first time around. Despite having materialized 47 orbs of wind in total, she only fired 37 of them in anticipation of the Juggernaut finding a way to escape it. It did cost it its tail and right leg, but the sheer power it used to jump away was just enough to escape the otherwise fatal blow. So, with 10 orbs left at her disposal, each were used in a way unlike anything we've ever seen from her before. Not only were they all larger and more potent than the others, but each represented one of the 10 irreplaceable companions she'd lost. It was kind of like how we saw in the anime, but rather than her constantly stopping and starting again, she would repeatedly explode the orbs into her own limbs in order to propel herself in different directions, essentially attacking herself in order to get into the optimal position. So, as the first 2 exploded into her boots and provided that forward momentum, the next was released at her side so she could dodge to the right instantly. Then, with another exploding into her right foot once more, yet again Ryuu would take off forward, accelerating far faster than any human either Belle or the Juggernaut had ever seen before. That said, repeatedly exposing herself to such explosive winds didn't come without its fair share of kickback. I mean, these were after all the same orbs that just previously shredded the very body of the Juggernaut. So, as the orbs at her feet tore the soles of her boots, the ones that impacted her side would fracture her arms. Not to the point that her body was broken, but enough that her flesh was smoking and skin was burning. But even so, no amount of pain was going to stop her until the Juggernaut was dead. She would shoot herself as many times as it took until that perfect opportunity arose. She would soar through the air, surrounded by her 10 sisters, crisscrossing the sky like a true embodiment of the wings of justice. If she was the sword intended to slay evil, then her friends were definitely the wings helping her achieve it. She was more than well aware that they were just hallucinations, but such sentimental delusions were exactly what she needed to continue pushing forward. It was knowing that those closest to her were right beside her that allowed her to fight for the future she wholeheartedly desired now. Before she was utterly stuck in the past, but now she was finally ready to say goodbye. Goodbye to those feelings of resentment and loneliness. Goodbye to the lingering shadows of her friends that haunted her so much. Before, all she wanted was judgment and redemption, but now what she wanted was the future. A future free from the shackles of her past, starting with the very monster that was causing it. So, as Ryuu used her Rasengan to finish off the Juggernaut, the two were finally free to return home now. There were still 36 floors left to traverse, but at the very least they had slayed the Calamity. Their adventure was over and they had come out victorious. They didn't beat the maze or the deep floors surrounding them, but they did survive long enough to be rescued, bringing us to the end of what's probably the best season of DanMachi so far. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the cut content. I know I'm about a month late, but I just got back from Japan and can now make videos again. There isn't a seasonal anime that I'll be covering this season, but I will be doing variety along with Season 1 cut content for Mushoku Tensei. So if you're a fan of one of the best isekais ever made, then be sure to subscribe to see more of that here. Until then though, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!